NPTEL lecture. This session will give you a short summary of the lectures that we have covered so far. The focus of today's lecture will be based on three novels, and they are The Mysteries of Udolpho, Wuthering Heights, and The Picture of Dorian Gray. So, let's start with The Mysteries of Udolpho. The Mysteries of Udolpho was written by Anne Radcliffe. Anne Radcliffe was a Victorian writer and a pioneer of Gothic fiction. Anne Radcliffe was born in the year 1764, and interestingly, this is the year that the first Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto, was published. Her works are largely invested with the themes of Gothicism and Romanticism, which later earned her the title the Gothic Enchantress. The ingenuity of this writer has been intellectually contagious enough to compel the poet John Keats from the Romantic era to address her, that is Anne Radcliffe, as Mother Radcliffe in one of his letters. Even her name became synonymous with the ideas of Gothic elements. And The Mysteries of Udolpho attains compellingly literary distinction by putting forward the ideas such as female Gothic and the explained supernatural. Anne Radcliffe started to write in a period where women's freedom were constrained and the strings of their purse were in the hands of the male members of the household. Besides creating a niche for herself, Radcliffe indeed took writing as a profession and succeeded in it. The novel Mysteries of Udolpho revolve around the story of Emily St. Aubert, the benign and sensible heroine. As the story progresses, she loses her parents and takes shelter under the custody of her aunt, uh, Madame Cheron. After acknowledging the connection of Valancourt with Madame Clerval, Madame Cheron agrees for the marriage of Emily St. Aubert with her lover Valancourt. And however, this marriage between Emily St. Aubert and Valancourt is thwarted because her aunt Madame Cheron gets betrothed to Count Montoni, who will eventually become the villain of this novel. And now this trio, Emily St. Aubert, her aunt Madame Cheron, and the villain, Count Montoni, is seen to be residing in the castle, eponymous castle Udolpho. And set in the late 16th century France and Italy, this novel delves deep into the aspects of Gothicism and romance. The mysterious heritage, the idea of Gothic double, and supernatural elements undoubtedly place this novel under the school of Gothic literature. The traditional Gothic episodes of jump scares and violence are comparatively subdued as the space in itself exudes a forbidding aura. For instance, the spatial pockets of the castle are overwhelming in nature. Besides the physical torture inflicted by Count Montoni, the female characters in the novel rather become victims as they also suffer from the psychic episodes of terror. For instance, we have already seen how Emily suffers a lot from her unbridled imagination than the actual happenings in her life. It is rather interesting to note that how Anne Radcliffe slips in the idea of terror through her narrative. For instance, when Emily St. Aubert enters the castle of Udolpho, she is seen to be gazing at the castle of Udolpho in a melancholy awe. At another situation, even the gust of air appears as if it is a voice of some supernatural being to Emily St. Aubert. And of course, there is a the element of past defining the present is also prevalent in this novel. And we can witness this argument in the story of uh, uh, Sister Saint Agnes. The idea of female Gothic uh, is shown not just through the character of Emily Saint Aubert, but also through other female characters as well. And the castle is an embodiment of oppressive sexual parochialism, distinctively evinced in the person of the tyrant Count Montoni himself. His imperious character renders him indomitable, and when it comes to dissembling his emotion, he is an inveterate impostor. He disguises his nature and goes on achieving his goal. Probably this would have aided him in trapping Madame Cheron into marriage. And his character wields influence as to find difference in other works of literature as well. For instance, in the work written by Jane Austen, that is Northanger Abbey, the protagonist, Catherine Morland, is seen to be referring to Count Montoni to her friend Isabella. So we see Catherine Morland saying it was the air and the attitude of Montoni, and this is a reference from the book The Northanger Abbey, and this shows how the cruelty of Count Montoni was very much prevalent in the episodes of literature. And when it comes to the heroine, we see that Emily is not really a rebel. Neither is she a revolutionary outcast. She stays within her sphere of domesticity and shows her resistance. And special attention has to be paid to the sensibilities of Emily St. Aubert, because she, as we have seen earlier, she maintains a balanced oscillation between her emotions and rationality. This in turn is actually a product of her father's early tutoring. And the idea of female Bildungsroman can be very well derived from the character of Emily Saint Aubert, because we see how the sensibilities of Emily Saint Aubert gets more refined and sophisticated when it reaches the end of the novel. And the string of art and aesthetics ties the characters of Emily Saint Aubert, her father Saint Aubert, and her lover Valancourt together. Their shared liking and admiration for the picturesque landscape is an ocular proof for it. The threat of female resistance is shown in snippets, which ostensibly get revealed through the characters of both Emily St. Aubert and Madame Cheron. Madame Cheron's refusal to sign the documents which will make her property uh, transferred to Count Montoni, and Emily Saint's Aubert to Aubert's refusal to marry Count Morono can be one such examples. And as we have seen in the earlier lectures, Emily battles against dual tyrants, that is, against the assaults inflicted by Count Montoni and also against her perturbed imaginations. The scene behind the black veil and her fainting after seeing the thing behind the black veil serves in justifying such an argument. And in this female Gothic Mysteries of Udolpho, Emily becomes a sentimental heroine as well. It is not because of her faintings and extremes of emotion, but because of her just sensibility. And the obfuscatory nature of the mysterious happenings in the life of Emily comes to a clearer light when it reaches the end of the novel. For instance, the story behind the wax statue, which stays behind the black veil, and also the entanglement of mysterious or naughty ties of Emily's heritage, clears the fog of mysteriousness in her life and as well as in the plot of the novel. And what can be inferred from such a revelation is that the author privileges the reason over fear. And these two quotes mentioned in the slides can be seen as a criticism on Anne Radcliffe's employment of explained supernatural. Now let's move on to the novel Wuthering Heights. And Wuthering Heights was written by Emily Bronte and it was published in the year 1847. Emily Bronte was born in 1818 in Taunton, Yorkshire. She has written nearly 200 poems and is best known for her novel Wuthering Heights. Critics have suspected the play of autobiographical element in the construction of this particular novel. For example, the drunken brother of Catherine would have been influenced from uh, Emily Bronte's own brother Ronwell. Similarly, the character of Joseph with Emily Bronte's aunt. Parallels can be effectively drawn between the character of Emily Bronte and Catherine, as we see both these characters gets attached to the setting that they are a part of. For example, Emily gets really attached to Howard's personage, and this gets reflected in the character of Catherine, where she identifies herself with the moor. Also, we see that Emily refuses to take medication when she was suffering from tuberculosis. This idea gets reflected in the character of Catherine as well, because we see Catherine refuses to eat anything, refuses food, and starves herself to death. And the popular understanding of Emily as a recluse or an antisocial person is curious because she is portrayed as a good listener by her neighbors. The natural genius of Emily can be surmised through this quote taken from Bronte's diary. It is clear from Emily's poetry in particular that imaginative inspiration was most often caused by the experience of weather and natural environment. The attachment of Emily Bronte with Howard personage gets reflected in this quote, and this element gets reflected in the character of Catherine as well, because she gets attached to the moor. Wuthering Heights is set in Yorkshire Moor in the early 19th century. To put the story in a nutshell, uh, the novel Wuthering Heights narrates the story of two families, uh, Anshas and Lintons, uh, who reside in Wuthering Heights and um, Thrushcross Branch. And the novel begins with Lockwood, a new tenant to Thrushcross Grange, meeting the master Heathcliff. The snowing cold weather and the beast-like dogs since cold chills down the spine of the visitor. The literary devices compel us to categorize this scene as a foreshadowing of the upcoming events in the uh, story. The novel proceeds from the narratives of both Nellie and Lockwood. So it becomes very clear that the novel has two narrators, and they are Lockwood and Nellie. The landscapes in the novel effectively uh, become an element of Gothic as it delineates the idea of strangeness through its description. And the quote given here is a description of Wuthering Heights as explicated by the character Lockwood. And this quote serves the purpose to say how the idea of coldness exists both within the characters and also pervaded among the entire, uh, um, entire heights. The characters in the novel Wuthering Heights attain transformation only when they uh, only when they cross their boundaries, only when they cross the transgress their habitual zones of domesticity, they achieve a changeover. So, for instance, we can see how a rude, um, savage like girl like Catherine transforms into a lady only when she transgresses the boundaries of Wuthering Heights and enters Thrushcross Grange. Similarly, Heathcliff's transformation into a gentleman kind of figure happens only when he transgresses Wuthering Heights. And the peculiarity of Gothic narrative demands the elements of isolation and trapping. And Catherine's isolation and hallucination as she dies can be a perfect example for such an argument. And despite the landscape, that is the setting, Emily Bronte utilizes the uh, animals to emit the Gothic trends in the novel. That is, Emily Bronte uses animals to bring in the Gothic elements in the novel. For example, the beast-like dogs uh, in Heights, as it scared people who comes to Heights, will be a perfect example for it. And interestingly, the children in this novel turns out to be uh, the reflection of the domestic sphere that they are brought up. We see Heathcliff and Catherine grow up as rude, as savages, as described by Nellie Dean, whereas the characters like Isabella and Linton grow up in a very gentle fashion. Here again, we are reminded of the storm and calm allegory that we have seen in the earlier lectures. The storm referring to Heathcliff and Catherine, and the calm referring to the Lintons. The role of class is very vital in this novel, just like Gothicism. So it can be rather argued to an extent that the idea of class provokes the idea of provokes the raw emotions from the characters. It would be clear if I give you an example. Like Heathcliff, due to his ill treatment from Hindley and Linton, Heathcliff vows to take a revenge on them, and he takes this revenge by conquering the class that Linton and Anshas possessed. So, the deplorable condition of Hindley caused by Heathcliff and also the ill treatment that Hareton receives in the hands of uh, Heathcliff shows the impact of economy and education. Even um, even Catherine's marriage to Linton would be a perfect example to show how the idea of class was very prevalent during that period. And the quote mentioned here depicts the kind of treatment, the kind of cruel treatment that Heathcliff received by from Hindley. And this treatment gets replicated or repeated rather uh, by Heathcliff to Hareton the later part of the novel. The aspects of uncultured savagery can be very well applied to the novel uh, because it brings in the raw emotion from the characters. When Heathcliff promises to take revenge on Hindley, uh, Nellie Jean admonishes him by saying that only God has the right to take no punish people, but Hindley Heathcliff uh, says that that God will not have the satisfaction that he will have by punishing Hindley. Such powerful statements shows or unmasks the real nature or the darker energies of human being. Even the calmer and amiable nature of characters like uh, Lockwood and Isabella are provoked or perturbed to bring out the raw emotions by the end of the novel because uh, uh, despite stopping her from entering the heights, Lockwood harms the child ghost of Catherine. He rather makes child he rather makes her to bleed as he scratches her hand against the window pane. The cold ambience prevails and prevails in the entire novel, both in the characters and also in the setting. And this idea of coldness becomes a very important factor in any Gothic fiction. Parallelism becomes one important element in Gothic narratives, and it gets materialized in Wuthering Heights. As it becomes materialized in Wuthering Heights, also it also becomes a recurring motive in this novel. The employment of dual narrators, twin landscapes, thematic parallels can also be drawn between the character of Catherine Earnshaw and Catherine Linton. Critics have also suggested that there seemed to be an element of incest and necrophilia embedded deeply into the structures of this novel. To an extent, it can be argued that we can view Heathcliff and Catherine through the lens of Gothic doppelgangers as well. And it becomes true when Catherine says, I am Heathcliff. He is more myself than I am. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same. This sentence by Catherine can be really employed to show how these both characters are one and not two different characters. And without any need for argument, it becomes very clear that the idea of patriarchy exists both in Trustcross Branch and Wuthering Heights. And the story conspicuously captures the Gothic horror of instilling crude gender roles as well. For example, the occasional repulsions that Catherine gets when she considers uh, Edgar to be less masculine than Heathcliff depicts the harmful impacts of instilling gender stereotypes in the minds of the children. Modern feminists also suggest that Heathcliff fits under each category as explained in the each category of being a misogynist villain, aristocratic villain, and Byronic villain because of his you know because he is propelled by his toxic or hegemonic masculinity. They are actually against the idea of romanticizing the relationship between Catherine and Heathcliff. Uh, the quote given here clearly expresses how the character Linton was actually feminized even through the descriptions of uh, even through the descriptions by Emily Bronte. The words such as a sweet picture, a long, long hair curl, and short-featured face. These are the words during that period were used to describe a woman. The airiness in the novel do not appear out of place. Rather, it merges along with the narrative. The sparks of Gothicism gets released through the expression of extreme emotions as well, such as anger, greed, hatred, and vengeance. Besides the wilderness of the landscape, Emily in this novel makes the Gothic perform in every possible way. Even in the last scene, we see a boy getting frightened because of seeing the ghost of Heathcliff with a woman. So it becomes very clear that the novel Wuthering Heights uh, fits under the category of Gothic literature. Now let's move on to the novel The Picture of Dorian Gray. The Picture of Dorian Gray was the only novel written by Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde, who is popularly known for his short stories and plays, is one of the chief proponents of the 19th century aesthetic movement, art for art's sake. This movement disregarded the moral principles from art and advocated to enjoy art for its formal aspects. To an extent, this movement can be seen as a response to Victorian prudishness and their rigid principle. And This particular novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, becomes eternally etched as its philosophy has contributed a mental syndrome named after the protagonist of this novel, Dorian Gray. The novel begins in an art studio, London, and eventually it becomes clear that it will revolve around three characters, and they are Basil Hallward, the artist, Lord Henry Wotton, the evil influencer, and Dorian Gray, the protagonist. The aesthetically chiseled structure of this novel imbibes deeper layers of semantics. And the idea of degeneracy and degradation are very well explained through the character of Dorian Gray as well as through the descriptions of London. The undercurrent of art and experimentation goes on unperturbed throughout this novel despite facing inexplicably horrible results. Such results are indeed due to the protagonist Dorian Gray's loose moral principles. The novel can also be considered as a cautionary example, and despite its moral suggestions, the novel was condemned for propagating immorality. The Gothic elements in the novel are carefully inculcated into the story that it serves its purpose of giving terror or bringing terror to the readers. Dorian Gray notices the changes in the portrait only after he breaks up with the actress Sybil Kane. So this subtly reinforces the idea that the portrait will reflect or mirrors Dorian Gray's corrupt soul. Nevertheless, he keeps on he continue doing he continues doing this wrong deeds and eventually becomes a slave to his sensual pleasures. The novel also conspicuously brings in the element of death and its terror. The resoluteness of Wilde to plainly portray the decadence and dissoluteness in people's attitude towards life is rather courageous and appreciable. And there also exists a tussle uh, of considering this novel as a Gothic fiction and a fiction decadent novel. However, the Gothic elements in the novel overpowers the aspects of decadency uh, portrayed. The novel is a telltale example of Nazism, and when Dorian looks at his portrait for the first time, which in the words of Oscar Wilde, I quote, his cheeks flushed for a moment with pleasure. So, this episode of yeah, this episode ignites the fire of desire or ignites the fire of pleasure within Dorian Gray that he gets attached to it deeply. And the portrait and the book gave him a temptation that was almost irresistible, and he eventually becomes a prey to it. The words given in the slide refers to the way of life that Henry Wotton advocated, and Dorian Gray becomes a fan of Henry Wotton, and he continues following the advice given by Henry Wotton. As we see that these words created a great impact in Dorian Gray that he can't really get rid of it. And Wilde has also volunteered to critique the Victorian sensibility, which usually uh, relayed the idea of beauty with goodness. The spotless, unblemished face of uh, Dorian Gray craftily masks his evil energy, his darker side. A wise parallel can also be drawn between the character of Dorian Gray with that of Dr. Faustus, written by uh, Marlowe. Dorian's indulgence into darker experiences and his experimentation with portrait rather is rather reminiscent of Faustus' uh, inquisitiveness to learn a lot and rule the world. Incidentally, even the character Lord Henry Wotton treats Dorian Gray not as a friend or a companion, but as an interesting study. There also exists a tussle between atavism and free will. So it could also be possible that Dorian's attraction towards worldly desire is because of the trait that he inherited from his grandfather, or it could also be possible that it could also be possible because of Dorian's own inherent nature of experimentation. However, the result was mere destruction to the self and also to the fellow beings. The gaulishness in the novel stealthily grows up and it unleashes its cruelty only in the final scene. The descriptions of opium dens and theatre do carry the Gothic tradition as well. And this particular Gothic fiction traces clearly the relationship between the connection between conscience and fear by showing their blended nature. The Gothic trend of doubling is very well maintained throughout the novel, and this idea of double gets hampered only when the character, the protagonist Dorian Gray, dies. And the idea of double can be seen Dorian as a person and also the portrait which represents his corrupt soul. Even his dual ways of living in public and private sphere contributes for the idea of Gothic double. Dorian Gray is dictated by a sense of shame that he is utterly concerned to guard his reputation, and that is the reason he covers his face. He rather disguises himself when he enters the East End, when he goes to the opium dens. The novel's Gothic elements are undoubtedly acquired from its fixation to death. Dorian's loss of innocence can be considered as its first occurrence, and this loss of innocence causes him to depart his ways from the actress Sybil Vane. And when he breaks up with her, he uses crude ways, and in crude ways he breaks up with her in a very unrefined, uncultured manner. He says without art she is nothing, and such uncultured way of dealing with people also marks his depth of morals, and this gets reflected in his portrait as well. Uh, Here again, we are reminded that this particular Gothic fiction, becomes a confluence of art and life. During their meeting, Dorian guiltlessly knives and kills Basil Hallward, and as the latter asked Dorian to repent for his sins. However, Dorian justifies of he killing Basil, saying that Basil was responsible for pulling Dorian into the world of pleasures by drawing the portrait. So even even the death of Alan Campbell would have been the result of his unexpected meeting with Dorian Gray. The portrait becomes a moral compass or a mirror reflecting the corrupt soul of Dorian Gray. And Dorian Gray gets rather repulsed by its appearance, and he gets repulsed by the appearance of the portrait. So he stabs the portrait instead, due to which he dies. And this marks the death of art, just like the death of artist Basil Hallward. This novel is an uncompromising piece of art embedded with Gothic features in every way. Thank you for watching the video.